Well, hello again, everyone. As you can see, I'm off the Enterprise today. Kind of an interesting circumstance. Let me tell you real quickly about it, and then we're going to get back into the 1820s and the Jackson era. But we were en route to Macus 3 to deliver some supplies. They're having an outbreak of some sort there on at New Paris Colony. But we encountered this strange quasar around Murasaki 312, and I was part of the shuttle mission that was detached to investigate. So we've been pulled off course, and we've landed at this planet. This planet is called Taurus 2, and we'll see what happens here. But that's kind of why I'm off the ship, and I'm kind of excited and kind of nervous about what might happen here. But while I'm here, let's talk about the 1820s. And you remember when we last left off, we were at 1823 and the Monroe Doctrine. And so now we're going to get into 1824, and that is an election year. And it's quite an election in 1824. You see, after the War of 1812, land was so abundant because the British had vacated the forts, and so there's all this land, and it was relatively cheap to buy, that the property land requirement for voting basically went away. There were still some states that had it, but most states by the 1820s did not. And so what that means is that now there is almost universal white male suffrage, which means almost all white males 21 and older can vote. This changes the landscape of voting and the type of candidate that will run and be elected eventually. The election of 1824 is kind of the transition election between the old way, where just the upper crust leading class in a kind of a Hamiltonian sense got to vote, and now more people get to vote. This was deemed by historians the new democracy. So this is going on in the mid 1820s. And so let's take a look at this election. And if you want to pull up a map of this election, it might be a little bit easier for you. But let's take a look. First of all, you remember that there are no political parties really, because this is the era of good feeling. And the Jacksonian Democrats haven't formed yet. The Democratic Republicans are kind of splintered to the point where there's really no political party. And so there are four major candidates in this election. They are John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams, kind of a man out of his time. He spent a lot of time with his father growing up, especially abroad in the diplomatic corps. And so he really has old Federalist style ideas, which are out of fashion at this time, by the time the Federalists have died after the election of 1816. There is a not young, but an up-and-comer named Andrew Jackson. And you remember we met Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. He is originally from the Carolinas, ran away when he was 14, but from Tennessee. He is brash. He is kind of out for himself in some ways. He is a populist, which means that he is kind of styles his speeches as a man of the people. And so that's Jackson. Then there is a guy named Crawford who suffers a stroke during the campaign, and so is kind of in ill health. And then there is Henry Clay, and you remember Henry Clay in the House of Representatives with the American system and that sort of thing. By this time, he is the Speaker of the House, so he leads the House of Representatives. And so these are the four candidates as we move into the election of 1824. Now, let's take a look at the popular vote. The popular vote has no one taking a simple majority, 50%, at least 50% plus one of the vote. The person with the most popular votes is Jackson with 43%, followed by John Quincy Adams with 31%, and then the other two split the difference. But as you know, that is not how we elect a president. It is elected by the Electoral College. And in order for a president to become president and take office, they have to have a simple majority in the Electoral College. Once again, that doesn't happen. Jackson will get the most electoral votes with 38%, and John Quincy Adams will get the second most with 32%. And so what happens then? Well, the answer is fairly straightforward. You need to go to the 12th Amendment, and the 12th Amendment says that if no one candidate and their running mate get a simple majority, then the House of Representatives, that chamber of Congress that is closest to the people, will decide who the president is going to be. And so this was the second time. 1800 was the first time. The second time in U.S. history that this happened. And so let's take a look at what happened. There is some concern about Jackson, that because he's seen as kind of a loose cannon. There is some concern about John Quincy Adams. Adams just is kind of not the right man for the job or for the times. Crawford is unfortunately dying, and Henry Clay is out of the running because he came in fourth, and there's no medal for fourth place. And so what happens here is that Clay will be leading the proceedings as Speaker of the House, and they have vote after vote after vote, and it is kind of deadlocked. And then John Quincy Adams wins after, I think there were something like 30 votes or something. Check me on that. And so what happens is that then Henry Clay is chosen by John Quincy Adams as the Secretary of State, which was seen as the stepping stone to the presidency at this time. Jackson and his supporters get all sorts of mad about this. They are sure that this was a corrupt bargain, some backroom deal, that John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay had this deal that John Quincy Adams said, you give me the presidency and I'll give you this sweet Secretary of State. That never happened. There's no evidence that that ever happened, but undeterred by the facts, Jackson and his supporters will make this the rallying cry and call this the corrupt bargain election of 1824 and start running already for the next election in 1828. And so that leads to John Quincy Adams being in the White House. And John Quincy Adams was spectacular before he was president. Look at the Adams-Onis Treaty, for example. He was a spectacular Secretary of State. And then after he's president, he does some amazing work, in areas like the rights of slaves and that sort of thing. The Amistad case in 1841, he will speak before the Supreme Court on behalf of these enslaved persons. And so he does some really good things, but as president, he is a misfit. He is a square peg in a round hole. His time as kind of a federalist leaning person is over. That we are moving toward a more populist party of the common man, as it turns out. And so he really doesn't do a whole lot or get a whole lot done during his presidency. That takes us to 1828. And in 1828, the Jacksonites are still really sore about this corrupt bargain in 1824. And so what they want to do is they want to discredit John Quincy Adams. And the way that they think they can do that is through the tariff. Now, stick with me here because this is kind of convoluted. And the first thing to know about this tariff is that it was never supposed to pass. Okay? So it was just so absurd that nobody thought that it would pass. Okay? So it was a tariff that put huge taxes or tariff duties on goods coming into the country, as high as almost 50% in some cases, which is an outrageous tariff, right? Now, let's think about sectionalism for just a minute. The South hates the tariff, right? Because their economy now, as we've seen, will revolve around international trade and in a growing degree, the cotton kingdom, okay? And so they don't want to see tariffs because tariffs will do two things. They will artificially raise prices of other goods in the South because there's not a lot of manufacturing in the South, and they will encourage other countries to raise tariffs in retaliation. And so the South doesn't like these tariffs at all, or even the thought of the tariffs. And they don't like John Quincy Adams anyway. And so that it was just another reason not to like John Quincy Adams. The West, it really depended. Generally, they were not all for the tariff, like Kentucky and Tennessee, that they were more Southern. Some in the Ohio River Valley, some states did like the tariff. Western states did like the tariff because the money from the tariff gave money for roads and other internal improvements, and they liked that. But generally, the Southwest was against the tariff with the South. But the Jacksonites weren't finished. They wanted a way to discredit John Quincy Adams in his own territory in New England. And so what they did was they made sure that one of these prominent tariffs of this tariff of 1828 was wool, because most of the manufactories in this time period were textile manufactories, and they would either make cloth out of wool or linen or cotton, and they had to import that wool. And so if the wool is more expensive, the thinking was the manufacturers will not go for it. But the manufacturers, to everyone's surprise, said, that's not a problem. We'll just raise our prices. And so what happens is when it comes before a vote, oh my goodness, the tariff passed. It didn't just discredit John Quincy Adams. Now it passed. And what are they going to do? Well, let's take a look. We have Jackson. Jackson has to support this tariff because it's his supporters that kind of put this whole scheme together. But Jackson's running mate, a man from South Carolina who is states' rights through and through and anti-tariff through and through, a guy named John C. Calhoun, will be totally against this. And in fact, that will pit Jackson against John C. Calhoun, even in the time that they are sharing the executive powers as president and vice president. So that's kind of the tariff, and the tariff will not get worked out until a compromise tariff in 1833. So let's take a look and just keep this tariff in mind, because it was, from a Southern point of view, especially John C. Calhoun point of view, a tariff of abominations. It was just a terrible tariff. And so that takes us to the election in 1828. By 1828, the shift had happened to the common man, the new democracy, and Jackson wins the popular vote with 56%, and he wins the Electoral College with 68% of the electoral vote. So he comes roaring into Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. didn't know what to make of this kind of non-politician coming into Washington, D.C. And so let's take a look at what happened when Jackson comes into the presidency. It all kind of starts out with his inauguration. His inauguration was craziness. His inauguration, hundreds or thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people, come to Washington, D.C. to wish him well. They cram into the White House. There are stories of people riding horses into the White House so they can see the president, people standing with muddy boots, because it is March, standing with muddy boots on the furniture and all this stuff that you could, the primary sources tell us you could barely breathe because there were so many people in there wanting to wish Jackson well. Well, how is Jackson on the eve of the inauguration? He is in mourning. He is really, really depressed because his wife had just recently died. And we'll get to that story in just a little bit. But he's trying to be happy, but he is mourning the death of his beloved Rachel, his wife, and he blames the media for killing her, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So just as the night is kind of getting going, he turns to a friend and says, "Get me out of here. I can't handle it anymore." And so his friend that just lives down the street from the White House, he and his friend ditch out the back, out a window, one source says, and goes and Jackson sleeps while almost the rest of the night, these revelers are around the White House looking for the president to shake his hand. And so that's that. And the rest of the story is that the White House staff had to get these people out because it took them days to clean this thing up. And so what they did, according to the primary sources, is they took this big vat of hard cider, of alcohol, and they put it outside, and that cleared out the building. So this gives you an idea of the type of follower that Jackson had. Okay. So let's take a look at Jackson and the Jacksonian presidency. There are a couple of things that you need to be aware of. First of all, Jackson really puts what's called the spoils system or the patronage system on steroids. This is where you put family members or your political supporters into positions of power so that they get paid, right? And they're doing a job, whether they're qualified for it or not. And this was very characteristic of the Jackson administration. In fact, as a result of this, the first person to actually steal $1 million from the federal government is a Jackson appointee. He was in charge of collecting taxes and tariffs at the New York Port Authority, and he overcharged people a little bit. And so that's what happens when you have this spoils system, is that it is just ripe for corruption, and that's what we saw beginning in 1829. The other thing is that Jackson really had a pulse, or wanted to have a pulse, on what the people were thinking, because he knew that's where his popularity came from, was the people. So he had groups of newspaper reporters and editors that supported him. He would have them kind of symbolically come into the kitchen, which was less formal than the dining room, right? And say, what's the word on the street? What are the people saying about this? And that's kind of how he ran his his presidency and his campaign was kind of keeping an ear toward his supporters. And that's Jackson. That was called the kitchen cabinet. Now, I want to remind you of an old film called Mean Girls. Maybe you've seen it in the archive, Mean Girls. And in this film, Mean Girls, if you haven't seen it, these girls have a burn book, they call it. And this is a book of insults to various other girls that they know. And it's very, very insulting to them. And it's kind of the people that they don't like, a book of people they don't like. And I think that in some ways we can look at Jackson through the lens of, although he didn't literally have a burn book, he had a list of people that he didn't like, and policy comes out of that. And so let's take a look at some of the people that he doesn't like and the policy that comes out of that. First of all, let's take a look at John C. Calhoun. Now, why doesn't he like John C. Calhoun? It goes back to the tariff, okay? And the tariff issue will really come to a head in 1832, and Jackson wants to kind of stick it to his vice president, and so he will do everything he can to support the tariff. And then when the compromise comes in 1833, he will claim victory because the tariff remains higher than it was before 1828. And so that's kind of how he gets back at John C. Calhoun. Now, Calhoun will argue, well, the tariff is actually lowered in 1833, so I win. So that's kind of neither here nor there. The next group of people that Jackson really doesn't like are Henry Clay, and you might remember back to 1824 and Henry Clay and the corrupt bargain election. That's where the animosity toward Henry Clay starts with Jackson. And a guy that we haven't talked about yet, a guy named Nicholas Biddle. Now, Nicholas Biddle is in charge of the Second Bank of the United States. This is the next morph of the Hamilton Bank. It had to be rechartered every 20 years, given permission to exist. And Nicholas Biddle was in charge of that bank. Now, Jackson was more of a Jeffersonian in this sense. He saw an agrarian future for the United States, and the bank did not support that. The bank supported, as you'll recall, manufacturing with loans. And so he wanted to kill the bank, in his words. And so this is how it all went down. Jackson was complaining about the bank, He always complained about paper money and money on ledgers. He didn't understand that. He said, what I want is hard specie, so coins, because they have value, which is a very common man way to think of the monetary system, right? And so what happens is the election is coming up in 1832, and Henry Clay and Nicholas Biddle have this idea. They say, okay, we have the support of Congress. Let's recharter the bank a few years early, knowing that Jackson will veto it. And then when he vetoes it, the people that support the bank, which are generally the rich folks, will not support Jackson, and he won't get reelected. Excellent. Okay, so their plan goes on through, and the bank is rechartered. And then what happens? Well, Jackson says, the bank is trying to kill me, but I'm going to kill it. And in this election year in 1832, he does kill the bank. He can't do anything about having the bank exist. Okay, so this federal bank still exists, but he says he can do through executive order, he can direct the money from tariffs, excise taxes, and the sale of public lands to the banks of his choosing. and he chooses what he calls his pet banks, or some banks in New York that aren't the federal bank. So he says, basically, you can have your bank, it just won't have any money in it, right? And so that's how he wins the bank war. The last person in his burn book is the head of the Supreme Court. And you remember last time we talked about the head of the Supreme Court, who was actually an Adams appointee, who really shaped the court, and this was John Marshall. He does not like John Marshall because John Marshall stands up to him. Jackson doesn't like being told no, and he doesn't like when being told no makes him look bad for the people that support him. And there were some particular people in Georgia that supported him. And so what the hubbub is in 1831 and 1832 is that the state legislature of Georgia is trying to take lands from some native peoples, the Cherokee in particular, and for westward expansion, for gold, you name it, right? And so in 1832, there is a court case called Worcester v. Georgia. It looks spelled like Worcester v. Georgia, but it's pronounced Worcester v. Georgia. And in Worcester v. Georgia, some defendants or some litigants bring on behalf of the Cherokee people, because the Cherokee cannot bring a case before the Supreme Court because they are not citizens. Native peoples will not get citizenship in the United States until 1924. We'll talk about that later. But what happens is that they will bring this case, and they basically say Georgia has no standing to take any Cherokee lands whatsoever. And John Marshall, looking at the Constitution, absolutely agrees with the Cherokee and rules in their favor. And he says that anything else is, in his words, quote, repugnant to the Constitution and the laws of the United States, unquote. And so what happens is Jackson says, or is purported to have said, Mr. Marshall has made that decision, now let him enforce it. Now, what does that mean? We don't know exactly what that means, but it sounds a little bit like a veiled threat. And so this is when Jackson really begins to order not only the Cherokee, but the rest of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, as they were called, to move to what is today Oklahoma. And this leads to the absolutely tragic Trail of Tears. And so that's what happens there. And so he gets back at the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by killing a third of the Cherokee Nation. So there's always this, he didn't think through all of his decisions. He thought this is a way to get back at so-and-so. He will be reelected in 1832 and will continue on until the election of 1836 when his protege is elected. Little Van, he's a used up man, Martin Van Buren, and we'll talk about that next time. But I think this is enough for this time, and I think there might be something afoot on Taurus 2. So I better stop here and go investigate. But thanks for your attention today, and we'll see you next time.